Okay, tonight, chapter 29 from 70 Faces. This is called Different Meanings of the Same Word. Now, this is absolutely one of the most important of all the methodologies for the simple reason that in Hebrew, words have many different meanings. The same word, the same root. Now, this is before we get into more complicated permutations. Here, we're just talking about straightforward. Words have different meanings, and it depends what context you're using a word. So, as you can imagine, so many words in the Torah, it depends how you're reading it. Shivim panim LaTorah, 70 faces to the Torah. So tonight we're only going to do one chapter because there are just so many examples, dynamite examples of what we're talking about. But I just do want to point out that this method can be used so extensively, and it is used extensively. As always, I can only bring really just a handful of examples, but just the knowledge that when you're dealing with a word, a root in Hebrew, have to look at what are all the different meanings and then different stories in the Torah. This story uses it this way, and this story uses it this way. And then, so what's the comparison? What's the connection? That's what we're going to be learning about tonight. So the first one, for those who have the book, it's on page 261 in the bottom. I love this one. This is right from the first verse in the Torah. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Everyone knows that the usual translation is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word for created is bara. Bereshit bara Elokim. So many years ago, I heard a Torah from Rav Ginsburg, who interpreted the same word bara is the same root as briut, health, good health. So how did he read the beginning? In the beginning, God began to heal the heavens and the earth. So I'll ask, what does that mean? Now, obviously, it doesn't take away from the meaning create, but a different way to say the same words, the same root is in the beginning, God began, we'll say through creation, to heal the heavens and the earth. So the question is, well, what is there to heal? It's the beginning of creation. What's there to heal? And here, this is where we bring in the teachings from the Arizal, which totally revolutionized Jewish thought, based on earlier Kabbalah, especially the Zohar. And that's the idea that before this world, there were many other worlds. According to the Gemara itself, there were 974 previous worlds. 974 previous worlds. But the Ari talked a lot about just the previous world, Olam HaTohu, the world of, we'll call it chaos. That is the world, excuse me, that Shvirat HaKelim occurred in, the breaking of the vessels. So now we have an obvious understanding of what it means. In the beginning, God began to heal, because this world, which the Ari called Olam HaTikun, the world of rectification, is made up of, is a composite of, is a continuation of the previous world, but that's shattered. And that this world is all about tikkun and healing. So that's why we could read it in the beginning. Through the creation of Olam HaTikun, this world, God began to heal the heavens and the earth. So here, this is a classic example of taking the same root, Bet, Resh, Aleph, Bara, but explaining it in a completely, I wouldn't say a completely different way. That's really not the right way to say it. In a complementary type of way. That's much more accurate. Now, the next one on page 262 goes very, very much with this. Here we took the first 3 words of the Torah, first verse, and now we're going to look at the last 3 words of creation, the finishing words of the creation of Shabbat. So that ends bara Elokim la'asot, that God made to do. This is the end of Vayachulu Hashemayim ba'aretz v'chol tziba'am, and God finished all of creation and rested on the 7th day, and he blessed it and he made it holy. And it ends that this was the end of creation, Asher bara Elokim lasot, that God made to do. Now, everyone asks, and we had a previous chapter, we might even have discussed this, when you have words that seem redundant. So this verse, everyone points out, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, that God made to do. Well, what does to do mean? It could have ended that God made. So the answer that's given in Chassidut and Kabbalah, and it's accepted throughout Jewish philosophy, that this last word, la'asot, which means to do, this world is called Olam Ha'asiyah. It's very, very connected to the last word of creation, is the word that we use for this world, Asiyah. You'll excuse me for a second. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dbaro. So the word la'asot is understood to rectify. That God made to do, that God made, and then he left creation, as it were, open for human beings to become partners with God in the rectification of the world. Why is this so important? Because, as I already mentioned, the Ari calls this world Olam HaTikun. And here the last word of creation is la'asot, but it means litaken. But that implies one of the most important ideas in all of Torah, is that God wants us as partners, that God didn't finish creation. It's not a done deal. It's not a one-time creation. God created the world in a way that it continues to develop, and that mankind has a very, very important place in helping God to develop, or in a sense, finish creation. So this is such an important part. That's why, in the Aleinu, every day we say L'taken Olam b'malchut, and the name of God, Shin and Daled and Yud, to rectify the world in the kingdom of God. So this idea of Tikkun Olam, it's true there are certain streams of Judaism that have made Tikkun Olam almost like the main centerpiece of their philosophy, but it's based on very solid Jewish concepts. We say it 3 times a day to rectify the world in the kingdom of God. And that is what we're doing here. That's how we become a Tselem Elohim. This is so important to say, because we're created in the image of God. So then we'll add, okay, we're created in the image of God. It's automatic. It's like we're there, we've accomplished it. No, every human being is a work in motion, is a process happening. And we have to earn being an image of God. We are created in the image of God, but to truly raise ourselves to the consciousness of being a real image of God means being a partner with God in the rectification of the world. So these first 2 are the beginning of creation and the end. So here we see the word la'asot, which we usually translated as to do, to make, to work. And here we're just adding slightly the idea to rectify, to heal. So that becomes the sandwich of the story of creation as told in the Torah, beginning with healing and ending with rectification. So these are such basic and important concepts. The next one also begins at the bottom of 262. And this is the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah. So in English, it reads like this. The lifetime of Sarah was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years, the years of Sarah's life. So again, we have what could be construed as a redundancy. It begins by saying, this is the lifetime of Sarah. And then it ends the same verse saying the years of Sarah's life. Well, we know that already. The beginning of the verse told us that. And it even told us exactly how old she was. So again, this is material for the commentators because any seeming redundancy needs to be explained. So the words for the years of Sarah's life at the end of the verse is Shnei Chayei Sarah, the years of Sarah's life. Shnei from Shanim. It's the plural of Shanim. Shanim is also plural, but it's a different way of saying the years of. Shnei Chayei Sarah. So it's brought down in Hasidut. You could read the same words in a different way. Shnei also means 2, Shnayim. So you could read it, the 2 lifetimes of Sarah. What are the 2 lifetimes of Sarah? One in this world and one in the world to come. And this is one of the main themes of the Parsha Chayei Sarah. And it was just interesting because just a few hours ago, I was teaching a group that I have in China. I have an ongoing group with a group in China. And I was asked a question, and I was trying to explain that many concepts in Judaism aren't spelled out in the Torah. They're alluded to, they're hinted to. There's an oral tradition with them. So if you look in the Torah and you look in the Tanakh, there's many allusions and hints to the world to come, the eternity of the soul. But to actually, the Torah never comes out and says it. So this parsha of Chayei Sarah, it becomes the headquarters of understanding. Now, Sarah is the first Jew to be buried. She's the first Jew who dies. And so the story of her death and her burial, especially how Avram arranges it, where he buried her, how he buried her. The name of the city, Hebron. Hebron comes from the root lechaber, to connect. And so the whole story of the burial of Sarah is connecting her life in this world and her life in the world to come. So that's what the sages say. The sages say, tzaddikim b'mitatam nikraim chayim, v'rashayim b'chayehem nikraim metim. That righteous people in their deaths are called alive, and not such good people in their lives are called dead. So here, again, Sarah is the first Jew who's dying. And in the city of Hebron, Hebron means lechaber. So the tradition is that, and we've all learned this, that Jerusalem is the ladder, the gateway where all prayers go. That's the whole story of Jacob and his dream of the ladder connecting heaven and earth. And by tradition, we have this idea that all prayers ascend or are funneled to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, and from there they ascend. That's this idea of facing Jerusalem, wherever you are in the world, of facing Jerusalem as a symbol that the prayers are going to go up. So just like Yaakov, when he woke up from his dream, he said, this is the house of God, and this is the gateway to heaven. But we have the same tradition about Hebron as being the bridge, the ladder between this world and the world to come. And Sarah has the merit, in a sense, she paved the way. She paved the way of this connection, this chibur, Hebron, from this world to the world to come. So now we can understand Shnei Chaye Sarah, the two lifetimes of Sarah, one in this world and one in the world to come. And it's also connected to the other name of the place is Marat HaMachpelah, the cave, the double cave. So what does that mean? So quite literally, there is a double cave there. In other words, if anyone's merited to go to Hebron and go to the burial places of Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, and Leah, know that the signs where they're buried is really above. There's a lower cave below the building where they're really buried. They're not buried where actually we have like this tomb. That's not where they're buried. They're buried below in the second cave. So it's called Machpelah because it's from the word kaful, double. It's a double cave. The other reason that they give is because it's the place of kaful, double, means a pair. And the other name in the Torah for the same place is Kiryat Arba. And of course, that's where you get the settlement of Kiryat Arba, right next to Hebron. Because in the Torah itself, it calls Hebron Kiryat Arba. Kiryat Arba literally means the place of the four. So who are the four? Rashi brings two opinions. One is that there were four giants that lived in Hebron at that time. And the other, the much more known one, is it's the burial place of four couples, Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, but preceded by Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava are buried in Hebron, and according to the Midrash, that's why Avram wanted to bury Sarah there, is because he came to understand that Adam and Chava were buried in that cave. And so he buried Sarah there, and that's why all the Avot in the Imo were buried there except for Rachel. But the idea of even this idea of a double cave is also this idea of this world and the world to come. So all of this is learned from the idea of Shnei Chayei Sarah, the two lifetimes of Sarah. The next one is on page 264, and this is a very, very important one. It says, and Yitzchak went out to converse in the fields towards evening time. V'yetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sadeh. Yitzchak went out to converse in the fields. And so for those who have the book, in the brackets next to the word converse, I put the words meditate, pray. Because according to tradition, this is when Yitzchak initiated what we call mincha, the afternoon prayer. We know that Avram initiated shachrit, the morning prayer. Yitzchak initiated the afternoon prayer, and Yaakov initiated the evening prayer. So this is, by tradition, when Yitzchak initiated the afternoon prayer. But what I want to talk about is the word lesuach, to converse in the fields. To this day, a conversation is a sicha, from the same root. Lesuach means to converse. But there's a very, very deep play on words here, because in Hebrew, a bush, or an ornamental bush that we have in a garden or out in a field is called a siach. Siach, suach, very, very connected. So here we see that Yitzchak, it doesn't say he went out to pray, and it doesn't say he went out to meditate. He went to converse. So this is what we would call an asmachta, a biblical support for the concept of hitbodedut. This is like the classic example of hitbodedut. Everyone knows that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov made hitbodedut a pillar of what he was giving over to his students. It was like, if you're into Breslov, you're into hitbodedut. It's like, it's very hard to separate hitbodedut from Rabbi Nachman's Torah. And he, in many ways, encouraged the students to go out into nature, if at all possible, to nature, and to converse, to talk to God as if he's right there and he's your best friend. This is the pillar of Breslov. But I have to say, even though we always attribute hitbodedut to Rabbi Nachman, the truth is, where did he get it from? He got it from his great-grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, according to all the stories, at age 5, was already going out into nature, into the fields, and talking to God, and praying and meditating and singing and conversing with God. And where did the Baal Shem Tov get it? So here we're bringing, like, this is like the biblical source for the idea of going out in nature. Because again, suach and siach, plants and conversing with God have the same root. And from this, you could go even deeper and understand the whole idea of what's called perak shira. the chapters of song where, according to tradition, either David HaMelech or Shlomo HaMelech or both of them conceived of this idea called Perek Shira, which attributes song to 70 different parts of creation. And so here we see that Suach and Siach. Why did Rabbi Nachman encourage people to go out into nature? And he wrote about this much because the life force in nature is so conducive when a human being connects themselves and gets on the same wavelength and picks up the same vibrational energy as the plant world, which is full of life. The combination allows our prayers to soar. So this is just a beautiful idea here. Again, based on the meaning of words, suach, siach, basically the same root and the different things we can learn from it. The next one is an incredible one. It's an incredible one because, and this is not the only example. So we're talking about different meanings of the same word. But we see that many times a Hebrew root will not just have different meanings, but will have absolutely opposite meanings, depending on how you use it. One of them, a very striking one, and it's in the Torah itself, is the word for holiness is kadosh. The word in the Torah itself that it uses for a prostitute is a kadesha, the exact same root, which is like, whoa, whoa. But this is not the only time. So we're going to look at two stories in the Torah that uses a phrase, and the meaning seems clear from the context of the verses or the stories. And yet Rashi comes and Onkelos comes with discussions in the Gemara that gives the exact opposite meaning. So what's the first case? The first case is with Tamar and Yehuda. Just in case someone doesn't know the story very quickly, Yehuda had 3 sons. His first son married Tamar and died. And so in a Levirate marriage, she now married the brother. He also died. And then Yehuda promised her, when my 3rd son grows up, you will marry him. The son was very young then, and Yehuda naturally is like, well, 0 for 2. I'm not so sure I want to make it 0 for 3. So he didn't give his last son to Tamar. And Tamar had what's called like a prophetic vision that she was meant to give birth to kings from Yehuda. And the famous story in the Torah, told in Parshat Vayeshev, she dressed up as a prostitute and enticed Yehuda. They were together, and afterwards, I'm trying to tell the story in short because I think most people know it, just to save time. In the end, he admitted he didn't know it was his daughter-in-law, but then the Torah says that he didn't continue to know her. Lo yasaf. From the context of the word, and lo yasaf, lo means no, not. Yasaf means to add on to Yosef. Yosef, the name Yosef, because Rachel, when she gave birth to Yosef, she named him Yosef. She said, now I should give birth to another son. It will be added onto me another son. So the clear meaning here is Yehuda, who thought she was a prostitute, now he finds out it's his daughter-in-law. It says he didn't continue to know her. What does Rashi bring? He brings the tradition, he didn't stop knowing her. So you're like, whoa, this is exactly the opposite of how everyone translates it. And yet, Onkelos also, and it's based on a Talmudic tradition. Now, there's a second time this exact same phrase is used, lo yasaf, and that's at the giving of the Torah, where it's talking about all the phenomenon that is happening. And it's talking about God's voice. In other words, God says the 10 commandments, and it says about God's voice, lo yasaf. In other words, it didn't continue to speak. It was a one-time in history revelation of God's voice. And it says, velo yasaf. And the voice did not continue. Again, what does tradition tell us? Says it never stopped. Never stopped. So here you have, this is like a classic example of, it's not a kri and a kativ. Remember, we've learned a word could be written one way and read in another words. And we actually learned that it's written lamed vav, which means to him, or the opposite. It's written lamed aleph, which means no, not. But you read it lamed vav, which means to him. But that's different. That we have a kativ and a kriya. We have a tradition that's how it's read and that's how it's written. But here you have the words written, and they most certainly seem to mean he did not continue, or God's voice didn't continue. And yet we're told it didn't stop. So here we have in Pirkei Avot actually a hint to this idea that it didn't stop, because it says every day a voice comes out from Sinai. And it's encouraging people to come back to tradition. So the Baal Shem Tov asked a classic question. He said, if there's a voice that comes out of Sinai every day, why don't we hear it? And if we can't hear it, what point is there to have a voice coming out? This was from the Baal Shem Tov. So he answered his own question. He says the truth is, anytime a person in a small way, a big way, a quantum leap of a change, or a small change, anytime someone makes a move to come closer to Hashem, to come closer to holiness, to the Torah, it's because they're actually hearing the voice. In the inner consciousness, they're hearing the voice. That's how the Baal Shem Tov answered his own question. It's a beautiful, beautiful teaching. So here we have this idea. Well, then you ask, well, I want to know, did Yehuda continue to have relations with Tamar or not? Which one is it? And so if you look in the Gemara, there are two different opinions. There are two different opinions based on the reading of Lo Yasaf. Some say it means he did not continue, and others say he never stopped. As far as in Sinai, on one hand, we don't continue to hear God like blasting from Har Sinai. In that sense, it did stop. But like Pirkei Avot said, and like the Baal Shem explained, in a sense, it never stopped. So we have somewhat of a contradiction here, somewhat of a contradiction. So if you hold that he didn't continue to have relations, and we understand that God's booming voice did not continue, so that makes sense. But if you want to say it continued, so what do you do? Yehuda continued to have relations, so how can you understand the other opinion that he didn't? So there's a way you could actually understand that he didn't continue in a physical sense to have relations with Tamar. But what did continue? They had children. And from that children came David HaMelech. And from David HaMelech came the kings of Israel. And from David and Yehuda and Tamar comes the Mashiach. So in that sense, he didn't stop knowing her. It continued. The Lo Yasaf can mean both at the same time. On one level, he did not continue. On the other level, the reverberation, just like the voice from Sinai continues to reverberate through all of history. What, you know, the common expression, you meet someone and you say, don't I know you? Have we ever met before? And they say, oh, we probably stood next to each other at Sinai. Everyone's heard that, call it a joke or whatever, but there's something really to it. In other words, the voice of God from Sinai is still reverberating. It's what keeps us connected. It's what keeps us connected. So this is just an amazing example of how a word or here a phrase can have two opposite meanings, the exact same phrase, depending on how you want to read it. Now, the next one is on page 271. There is a very good chance that I've learned this with some of you before, so you'll pardon me, but it's such an important one. It's such an important one. And this is the word Kabbalah. The word Kabbalah, what does it mean? So it obviously means to receive. And the simple understanding of what is Kabbalah? Kabbalah is the received mystical tradition. Now, just as a clarification, the connecting the received mystical tradition to the word Kabbalah is only about 1,000 years old. Before then, the mystical tradition was called by many different expressions. Ma'aseh Bereshit, Ma'aseh Merkava, Torat HaChen, Torat HaNistar, many different words for the mystical tradition. Around 1,000 years ago, it kind of stuck to call it Kabbalah. In the Talmud, the word Kabbalah appears somewhat often. There it has a different meaning. It's more like the received oral tradition of what the written tradition means, much more than the mystical. So it appears in the Kabbalah, but again, it means received. So this is a Torah from Rav Ginsburg, and it's really, really important. So he points out that this three-letter root, Kuf Bet Lamed, Kabel, only appears in the Chumash 3 times, all in the same context, none of them in the meaning of to receive. in its other meaning. Lahakbil means to make correspondences, to make connections between things. Where does it come from? It's in the Parsha of Trugman, when it's talking about putting the curtains together of the Mishkan. And it explains that on one side, and there were sets of curtains, but then they had to put the sets together in order to make the surrounding energy of the Mishkan. So on one side of the curtains, there were 50 loops, and on the other side, there were 50 clasps. And the Torah says that you should put together, you should make a correspondence between the clasps and the loops. And when you do it, it ends, and it says it 3 times in the meaning, the root, lahakbil, to make these connections. And then it says, v'haya hamishkan echad. When you put the curtains together, then they will make the Mishkan one, because they will create the space for the Mishkan. V'haya hamishkan echad. So Rav Ginsburg, it's a very, very simple Torah, but it's so important. He said, what is the purpose of Kabbalah? What is the purpose of the mystic tradition? He said it's a type of learning which helps us see how everything is connected. It helps us see the correspondence between things until we could see that it's all one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. He said that is the purpose of Kabbalah, is to learn to see and understand the connection between everything that's happening in our lives, everything that's happening in the world, everything that's written in the Torah, to see connections where sometimes you don't see them right off the bat. So this is just such an important understanding of why do we study Kabbalah? Why do we study certain works of Hasidut? What are we trying to get out of the mystic tradition? And so again, the way Rav Ginsburg is explaining is that it's a type of teaching that is putting us together. I usually don't comment, but yes, the 10 curtains allude to the 10 sefirot. Okay. Now here's another one, which I love. Page 272. I heard this from Rav Shlomo. It's not his Torah, and to be honest, I can't remember what his source was, but sometimes you learn something, it's nice, it's important, but sometimes you learn something and it changes the way you see something forever. So what I'm about to tell you, at least for me, changed Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur forever. Ne'ilah is the last prayer of Yom Kippur, the 5th and final prayer. Everyone knows that Ne'ilah is high energy. It's the end of Yom Kippur. It's the end of the 10 days of Tshuva. It's the end of 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul. It's the end of the fast. It's like people get incredible spurts of energy at the end of Yom Kippur. But what does Ne'ilah mean? Ne'ilah means to lock. A lock is a na'ul. Ne'ilah means the locking of the gates. So what have we always been told? We've always been told, and it's not wrong, but we've been told that after the whole process, at some point it ends. it ends. And so everyone, get your prayers in before the gates close. That's the image. So one of the Hasidic rabbis said, that's a very jarring image. You mean after a whole day of davening, a whole 10 days of davening from Rosh Hashanah, a whole 40 days of spiritual work, a gate is going to close in our face and be locked? So this Rebbe said, this is how you should see it. He says it's as if God comes to every individual and says the following, you know, it's been a busy day. There's lots of people putting in their petitions, and I'm listening to everyone. I'm taking everything into consideration. But before the gates are closed, I'd like to give you a private audience. So please come in through the gate and close it behind you. When I heard this Torah, I was like, oh my gosh, that takes Ne'ilah, the shutting of the gates, and turns it around completely. You're not on the outside with the gate closing in your face. You're having a private audience with the creator of the universe. So that's, for me, that's an example of a Torah that I heard, that any Yom Kippur, how can I not think of that? How can I not have that, that image? So, as always, there's so many more. There's some really good ones here in 70 Faces that we didn't get to. But I think this is a good Ne'ilah. We're going to close this class, but it's not really closed. Why? Because we're going to have our post-class discussion. So that's a good way to see it. So we'll end with a bracha that, just like I started, like what we discussed tonight applies to so many words in the Torah, so many phrases that we learn to translate it in a certain way. Most books will translate it in a certain way, but when you start learning Hasidus, all of a sudden you see, whoa, this really is Shivim Panim LeTorah. There's so many different ways you could read the same word, so many different nuances in the same root. Again, this is even before we get to permutations. And you know what? I am going to add one more. And that's on page 274. And this comes from Avram Abulafia. Avram Abulafia lived approximately 1,000 years ago, and he was very controversial in his life, and he was very controversial until now. In the last, 40, 50 years, there's been a resurgence of interest in Avram Abulafia, and for good reason, because it's a well-known fact that despite the controversy about him, and we do not have time to go into this, anyone can Google about Avram Abulafia, but he taught what he felt was a prophetic tradition in Judaism. And he explained many things that had been very, very hidden until he began teaching them and writing about them. To this day, all of his manuscripts remain in manuscripts. even though it's well known that that many of his students and Chaim Vital, the Ramak, the Ari were influenced tremendously by him. But again, because of the controversy about him, it stayed somewhat dormant. Why am I bringing this up? Just because I said the word permutations. We are going to get to a whole section in 70 Faces about permutations. And he taught a type of meditation based on permuting words. And he taught that if you do it in the way that he teaches, it could lead to prophetic experience and even to prophecy. And that's probably the most controversial part of it, is that he made some very, very lofty claims. Along with this, again, those who will take the time to Google, he made a pilgrimage to the Pope to try to turn him on to Yiddishkeit. It's a whole incredible story. He almost died in the process. Anyways, he's a very fascinating purpose, and it's acknowledged that his influence on Kabbalah is immense, despite the fact that you can get excerpts from his works, but to this day, they're all in manuscripts. And so the reason I'm bringing that, because he took a verse, and the verse is in the 18th Psalm, the 31st verse, 1831 in Psalms. And we usually translate it like this: God, whose way is perfect, the word of God is pure. I'll say that again. God, whose way is perfect, the word of God is pure. So the word for pure is serufa. Serufa. This same word is used in Hebrew for permutations. Siruf otiot. Now, siruf, it means like a smelting process. When it says also in Hebrew, when you smelt a metal to get a pure metal, it's serufa. So when it says that God's words are pure, there's other connotations to this word pure. And one is smelting, and one is permuting words. So Avram Abulafia read this based on Sefer Yetzirah, because Sefer Yetzirah uses this word to mean permuting letters and words. So he reads it like this. The Avram Abulafia read it like this: God, whose way is perfect. That's the first part of the verse. And then he reformats the second part to read, is revealed by permuting the words of God found in the Torah. So here is a classic example that he, from learning this and learning how the Sefer Yetzirah uses this word, he developed this entire concept of Kabbalistic meditation based on permuting the letters. And as I said, his teachings had a profound effect on the development of Kabbalah. Like I said, despite in his day, he was very controversial and he was shunned and pushed to the side. But now that we have more perspective, we can see the incredible contribution that he made to Kabbalah. So thank you all for coming, and we all should have a blessing to continue to delve into the depths of the Torah.